Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey everybody, and thanks for joining me on another solo episode of the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. Every leader knows what firefighting mode feels like. You walk in for the day, something's already on fire, and you spend the rest of the day in reaction mode, never quite getting to the things that you would plan for the day, and definitely not getting to the things that would actually move your business forward. And it's easy to blame, the people or the workload, but the reality is that the constant firefighting is really just the system that you've built. And I would say that's the bad news, but the good news is because you've built it, you can rebuild it, right? In a completely different way. So that's what today's episode is all about. I think there's a lot of different stories to dive into with this. And as I was thinking about putting the show notes together, this core theme around, why is constant firefighting the system that you've built? I can't remember. I always butcher this, but I can't remember the exact, attribution for this quote, right? But it's the system you've built is perfectly designed for the results it achieves, right? When you think about what that reactiveness is, and that you as a leader, whether that is a department, team lead, department lead, right, business unit lead, whatever, kind of area of responsibility is yours, ultimately what happens is you kind of become, the gatekeeper of information and responsibilities for everybody, right? So you are reinforcing it kind of through every action, where instead of, what I tell people is, look, we want to provide the bounds and provide the goal for folks. And what we really want is to encourage critical thought within those things, right? And unintentionally, often what we've done is we've, removed the ability to have critical thought, right? And therefore, with those different iterations, you become, as the leader of that area of responsibility, you become the kind of ultimate gatekeeper, where people are literally coming to you every day with their problems, or what should I do next? Or what do we do in this scenario? How do I handle this problem over here? Right? So we unintentionally do it. And again, we do it through reinforcement. We do it through our actions. We do it through, process development, believe it or not, where the intention is, great, right? Like we're trying to document this process. We want to have SOPs. We want to have best practices. But a lot of times, unfortunately, that stuff morphs into the removal of critical thought from the folks on our team. And generally, all of that stems from, something happened, right? Some output was outside of the expected output. We reacted in a way, and this happens over time, we reacted in a way that started to erode their confidence and their trust in that critical thought process. And therefore, they started to default to coming to you with everything, right? So that's what I tend to see a lot of times. And, this kind of plays out in a variety of different ways, right? So, like one of my favorite stories, and again, it's everywhere. I'm sure you can find some of your own stories within your own organization, but, working with manufacturers, a lot of them like to talk about, proactive, or preventative maintenance, right? But the reality is that most of the time they are reactive, in the sense that, they wait until a piece of equipment breaks until they actually go ahead and, repair that piece of equipment, right? And, it could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe the, spare parts are, perceived to be too expensive, or they don't want to leave those, in inventory or on the shelf. They, again, a variety of reasons to not get into the weeds with this, right? But what I tend to see happen is that in that scenario, there's often a, critical project or, order that has to go out. And so that piece of equipment happens to break at the literal, worst time, where now we're disappointing customers. And inevitably what happens is that because we've built this system around us, this kind of, constant firefighting, you being the kind of, supreme gatekeeper, right? What happens? It breaks. Somebody comes to us and says it broke. And then a cascading events, start to get triggered, right? Great. Now we're going to have an upset customer. Now I got to deal with that. I got to go deal with, the kind of front end of the business and, make sure that we communicate that. We have to maybe, expedite both whatever is done of this order so they can have, some partial shipments. We also need to now expedite this, potentially broken, component within this piece of equipment. And so, the kind of dominoes fall, right? So, that's kind of like just one example of how this stuff ultimately starts. And, the second part of that is, why do we stay stuck in that? And again, why is it? Because we've built out, we've built the system around us of this, but it's I never have time, to go back and deal with all of the issues, right? Like, oh, if I only had the time, maybe we could, spend some time understanding like what kind of critical failure components are most likely to fail. Therefore, we should, keep those parts in inventory. So we've got, a stock of them we can get back up and running and not lose a lot of, equipment downtime. Or, oh, if I only had, this team member or that, thing happen, then I could get to this, right? There's never an appropriate time. There will never be enough bandwidth, enough people, right? And my argument, especially when we talk about things that are related to, equipment failures or missing deadlines or, products or services even that need to be redone for a variety of reasons. It's kind of like, well, we never have time to shift from that reactive to proactive. We never have time to, kind of tear the system down and rebuild it in a way that's different. But shockingly, we always find the time when it's an emergency, right? And that's just because there is no other alternative, right? Like, we have to deal with it kind of task at hand. So we don't have the luxury, if you will, to say like, oh, we don't have time to, to deal with this. We don't have time to shift again from that reactivity to being proactive because, we have all of these other things going on. Oh, we're busy. Oh, we're shorthanded, right? Whatever the case may be. And I guarantee if you've been in leadership for, really any length of time, this is all stuff that, that you can come up with your own really great examples of how this stuff ends up happening. So, beyond ourselves as leaders and kind of, building ourselves into this, ultimate gatekeeper of, information tasks, kind of, problem solving, firefighting and that kind of like culture has a real impact across the team. And generally when I'm talking to leaders about this stuff and starting to unpack some of the early signs of, chaos and just this, kind of gatekeeper persona, right? Like this firefighting, I'm often asking about what kind of turnover, what their onboarding and training looks like, what like how people know what to do in certain circumstances, because those are great clues to me, after having done this for as long as I have, that's the system that we're kind of working within, right? So I already know going into it the kind of work that's going to be required. I tell people, like, it took you a while to get to this point, and depending on how kind of how much chaos there is, right, how much firefighting you're doing, it's probably going to take us a little while to kind of walk out of it as well, right? So it's never impossible, but it really does come down to starting at the top, starting with yourself, looking in the mirror and saying, like, do I really want to change this, right? Do I want things to be calm? Do I want to come in and be able to get to maybe some strategic initiatives, or brainstorming on some new products that we could potentially work with, R&D, or whatever kind of department and or team that's responsible in your specific situation would be. Or do I enjoy, kind of what I call Groundhog Day, just knowing that every day is going to be chaos, and I know I might have a quiet half an hour, or I might just get met right at the entrance with 5 things that are just in, total dumpster fire mode, that I'm going to have to basically, barely set my coffee down and go and triage all of that, right? Some people thrive in that chaos, and some people don't want to change, right? And that's really where it starts, because I've said this before, and again, depends on your org structure, right? But if you think about it, whether you are, C-suite, owner, board, and then middle management layer, like if you're starting up at the top and you want this stuff because you see what the impact is from a financial perspective on the business, but the person in the middle, or even lower, as you get out to the folks that are actually doing it, if they have no appetite, if they think everything is fine, if they enjoy being that gatekeeper of tasks, information, responsibilities, etc., it's going to be a real struggle, right? Until either that person gets on board, or that team gets on board, or you find somebody else that is on board that can actually execute. If you're stuck in the middle spot, right, that middle management layer, that's where I spent the majority of my life, reporting up into the C-suite, and then, board of directors beyond that, and then trying to get all of, the direct and indirect reports that were reporting up through me, to get out there and execute and do these things, right? It can be an equally treacherous journey, right? Because you may have pressure from both sides, right? You may have pressure from below saying, I don't want any more responsibility. I like, being told exactly what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. And you may also be fighting that up top, where you're trying to get this culture of continuous improvement, and, they are constantly kind of, pushing back or holding the line and saying things like, hey, you need to make sure that this is happening, that's happening. And, it's still very much that top down thought process, right? But all of this stuff impacts the entire organization. Culturally, it for sure has a huge impact, financially, both, kind of profitability, cash flow, but I also say like rev gen, also, right? Like just getting out and maintaining market share and or growing market share. Chances are, I don't have some numbers, off the top of my head to contextualize this for you, right? But it's like, I don't remember working with a company or being in a company that was kind of this, daily triage, or even weekly triage that was also growing market share significantly. Maybe they were maintaining, maybe they would lose a bit of market share, but then make up, in terms of, profitability or something like that. But I would say, that generally doesn't happen, right? So those are some of the, ultimate kind of symptoms that you'll start to see. But again, I go back to symptoms versus root cause. The real issue is that this is the system that has been built internally. These are the checks and balances. These are the bounds that have been defined within your organization. And again, doesn't matter if this is an SMB with 13 people or a upper mid market company with a few thousand people. I've seen this exact same scenario play out across both of those different types of org structures. So that's all the the problem, right? Current state. What do we do to actually walk out of this? The easiest thing in terms of, there's a bunch of different frameworks, right? And I think for anybody that's followed me for, any length of time, that I don't really care what the frameworks are, but what I'm always trying to do is find the simplest way to understand, the concepts and ultimately how to enact change, right? And I think when it comes to, the macro kind of problem, right? Like, so the root cause and how we actually walk out of this, I come back to like my, clarity, consistency, and accountability framework. And the reason I come back to this is because oftentimes in those types of orgs that you are constantly chasing, your tail and not really making a lot of forward progress or feeling much momentum, is because there's not a lot of clarity. There's not clarity with roles, there's not clarity with reporting structures. And then if there is some clarity, then guaranteed you're missing on the consistency piece. Because, today it's red, tomorrow it's blue, right? Like today it's a problem because, whatever, and tomorrow it's like, no big deal. So thinking through, what is happening in those triage moments, who's coming to me with a problem, who really should be owning that problem? How have we set up the, bounds and goal to be able to navigate that problem within our organization, right? Like clarity, consistency, accountability. So if we start with the clarity and understand, the who, what, why, when, where, right? Then it becomes really easy to be consistent because now, both parties, I'll say, right? And this could be one to one or one to many, right? But like everybody's on the same page. And a lot of the conversations that I end up having is, oh, well, they know, right? They know, or so-and-so knows. It's like, really? How? It's like, well, we've had conversations. Really? Like, do you have those documented? Like how often, when's the last time? And the deeper, I start to poke at that, the less confident generally those folks become, because the reality is, and again, it's not intentional, right? The reality is in the day to day, in the, kind of trial by fire, we think we're being clear. We're not. We think we're being consistent. We're not. We want to hold people accountable because we think we're clear. We think we're consistent. But we really can't, right? And, we can't because it's unfair. That's how we ultimately end up cycling through people. Seen that, a good number of times because we haven't done the work of the first two, right? We haven't been consistent, or we haven't been clear, and we haven't been consistent. So that's, from a macro perspective, clarity, consistency, and accountability. As we start to, kind of dive down deeper, we start to talk about, the 4 pillars of an effective business system, planning, people, process, technology. So kind of depending on, where some of those initial, who's coming to me, what's happening, who should really own it, what systems are we, talking about that are being touched there, then we want to look at those things through that lens, right? Chances are that we've also tried to, throw some technology. Oh, it's not, this particular tool that's effective. We're going to try this, right? Same thing. We need to really be, like looking at, the process lens, but bringing in people into that conversation to better understand it, to make sure that we've optimized it, and then, taking a look at an appropriate tool, whether that is a, selection, configuration, implementation, whether that is a reconfiguration and a re-implementation of something that's already existing, whether it's something that can be done literally manual without even touching any of that kind of tech infrastructure. Right. But generally, again, when I start to zoom in on this, it is more times than not, planning, people, process, that we start to uncover, like how can we actually, move the needle on this particular thing. So, another, again, not to make this a full on kind of framework walkthrough, right? But another aspect of all of this, right? Walking out of this, kind of rebuilding our system so we're not in this, firefighting mode, is a cycle of improvement. And whether you do the, plan, do, check, act, lean and continuous improvement thought process, or, you use ours, the plan, execute, review, revise, repeat. Again, I don't really care, but understand that everything takes, the idea, the planning, some lightweight planning. You've got to execute on it. And then it's, review, revise, repeat, right? That's how this stuff ultimately ends up changing. It, again, back to what I said earlier, it took you some time to get to this point. It took you some time where, you are the person with the fire hose every single day. And it's going to take you some time to walk out of that, right? To understand like what systems are being impacted, what specific systems need to be rebuilt, how we develop that clarity, consistency, and accountability across the org, and the cycle of improvement is the way to kind of execute on that, right? So we're not just in analysis paralysis. We're not just, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what happens, right? It is a thought out, kind of, coordinated effort, I guess is the best way, to say it. So, So as a reminder for any of the folks that are tuning in, each one of these solo episodes is a extension of our free weekly newsletter, Business System Saturday. And I'd like to thank you for tuning in. I'd encourage you to go check that out. And I'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.